My name is Clara Hamilton. I grew up believing my father's approval was the measure of my worth. For years I chased it. In every award, every photograph, every quiet moment, I hoped he'd notice me. But on Christmas Eve 2023, under the glittering chandeliers of our Greenwich estate, he lifted his glass before a room full of people and said, "My daughter's an artist, but she's not getting a cent from me." The laughter that followed should have broken me. Instead, I smiled, because that night I finally stopped seeking his permission to exist. And months later, when CNN named me Woman of the Year, I realized success isn't revenge. It's freedom. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The Hamilton estate in Greenwich shimmered with light that night. Golden chandeliers glowed against the tall marble walls, and a 20-foot Christmas tree touched the ceiling, its ornaments glinting like tiny stars. A jazz trio played "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," and the air smelled of champagne, pine, and money. Every guest there had a title that carried weight. Judges, corporate lawyers, politicians, and old friends of my father, Richard Hamilton, the man who believed power and respect were one and the same. From the corner of the grand hall, I watched him hold court effortlessly, his laughter filling every space. My mother, Evelyn, stood beside him, polished, gracious, a perfect hostess trained by years of practice. My brother Ethan was near the bar, surrounded by partners from the firm, glowing under the praise he had learned to accept as naturally as breathing. And then there was me, the daughter who didn't fit the family portrait. I ran a hand down the emerald dress I'd saved for months to buy the one that still made me feel like an imposter among pearls and designer gowns. In my clutch was an envelope, a formal invitation from CNN. My series Light Exposes Lies had been shortlisted for their Women of the Year program. It was the kind of recognition every artist dreams of. I had planned to tell them tonight, maybe after dessert when the timing felt right. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Tara lit up the screen. "Tonight's your moment. Don't let him crush it." I smiled faintly, but my stomach tightened. She knew me too well. The night moved on like clockwork, perfectly choreographed. Servers gliding between tables, guests clinking glasses, laughter rippling like music. I stood near the edge of the crowd as my father took the stage, his presence commanding silence without effort. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice deep and smooth, the tone of a man used to being quoted. "As this year closes, I'm reminded of what makes the Hamilton family proud. Commitment, discipline, and integrity." Applause followed. I glanced at Ethan, who lifted his glass with practiced modesty. "My son Richard," continued, "has shown extraordinary dedication at the firm. At 34, he's already become our youngest vice partner. The future of Hamilton and Pierce Law Group is safe in his hands." The crowd cheered. Ethan smiled, uncomfortable but glowing. Then my father paused. I knew that pause. It was the one that came before the punch. And of course he added, "There's my daughter Clara." He let my name linger in the air just long enough for every eye to turn toward me. My dear girl who believes taking pictures of strangers is a sustainable career. A true artist, as she says. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Well, at least she has passion. She'll need it, because she's not getting a cent from me. The laughter grew louder this time. Polite, but cruel. My mother's lips tightened. She looked down at her glass of wine, swirling it as if searching for words she'd never say. Ethan stared at the floor, jaw clenched. And I stood there still. I felt the air leave the room, replaced by a heat crawling up my neck. Every face around me blurred. Colleagues of my father, his friends, people who had sent me birthday cards signed with pity. I heard someone whisper, "That's a shame. She's beautiful, though." I could have walked away. I could have laughed it off. But something in me refused to shrink. I stepped forward just enough for my voice to carry. "You don't have to worry, Dad," I said evenly. "I never asked for your money." The music stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. My father froze mid-sip, his expression unreadable. Around him, silence grew heavy, awkward, almost suffocating. Even the waiters paused. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then, as if on cue, my father chuckled. A sharp, dismissive sound. "That's my girl," he said, raising his glass as though the humiliation had been part of a joke. But no one laughed this time. The air had shifted. I looked at my mother, hoping for a flicker of warmth, a defense, anything. She met my gaze for a fraction of a second, then turned away. I could see her throat move as she swallowed hard. The pianist resumed playing too quickly, as if to mend something that had already broken. Conversation started again, nervous and forced. My father went back to shaking hands. I set my champagne flute down on the nearest table, the glass ringing faintly against the crystal. My voice, low but steady, filled my head. Don't give him the satisfaction. I walked toward the exit, my heels tapping softly on the marble floor. Behind me, laughter rose again, thinner this time, like static. Through the glass doors, snow drifted against the porch steps. The cold air hit my face like clarity. Tsab. I looked back once. Through the windows, the ballroom shimmered golden, perfect, untouched, as if the world inside didn't even notice someone had just walked out. Sometimes I whispered to myself, silence hurts more than cruelty. As I stepped into the night, the sound of Silent Night floated from inside the house, slow and sweet. It followed me down the long driveway until it faded into nothing. And that was the moment I decided I would never stand quietly in that room again. I used to believe that if I tried hard enough, my father would finally see me. When I was 10, I used to hide beneath the long mahogany dining table during my parents' dinner parties. From down there, I could see their polished shoes and hear the adults laugh in low, confident tones. One night, while the guests sipped wine and complimented the house, I heard my father's voice rise above the noise. "Clara's a dreamer," he said, his tone half amused, half dismissive. "Not as practical as Ethan." Laughter followed. My mother's nervous giggle came next, an attempt to soften the remark. "She's still young, Richard," she said quickly. "She'll find her way." I remember gripping the camera my grandmother had given me, a small scratched Canon that used to smell faintly of her perfume. I lifted it just enough to peek through the lens, framing the pattern of candlelight flickering against the white tablecloth. Even then, I understood light better than I understood people. The Hamilton house was the picture of old Connecticut wealth. Family portraits in gold frames, a piano that no one played, and plaques from my father's firm covering the walls like armor. There was a photograph of him shaking hands with a senator, another of him standing beside a courthouse ribbon-cutting. The house itself was proof of his victories, a place designed not to live in but to be admired. My father's rules were simple. Hamiltons didn't cry, didn't fail, and certainly didn't waste time chasing dreams. Hamiltons make law, not art, he used to say, the same way other fathers might talk about family recipes. Ethan absorbed it easily. He was obedient, brilliant, and everything my father wanted. I wasn't. I used to spend hours lying on the floor of my room watching the way sunlight shifted across the ceiling. When I tried to capture it with my grandmother's camera, my father caught me once and shook his head. "You could be reading a legal brief instead of wasting film on windows," he muttered before walking away. I learned to stop showing him my pictures. When I was 17, I got my acceptance letter from Columbia University's School of the Arts. I ran downstairs holding the envelope, hoping, ridiculously, that he'd be proud. He skimmed the letter once, then folded it. "You're throwing your life away," he said. "I won't fund that nonsense." He walked out of the room before I could respond. My mother followed him with her eyes, but said nothing until he was gone. Then she handed me an envelope of her own, $200 in cash. Small bills, folded neatly. "Don't tell your father," she whispered. "He doesn't understand art. Just don't make him feel humiliated." That was her way of loving me. Quiet secret hidden behind closed doors. I loved her for it, and resented her all at once. New York was the opposite of home, Loud, messy, alive. My dorm room was small and smelled like coffee and old textbooks, but it was mine. I took photos of everything: raindrops on subway windows, street musicians in the cold, the reflection of neon signs in puddles. For the first time, the world didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. Every few weeks, my grandmother Julia would call. Her voice was soft, warm, like the smell of cookies she used to bake. "Don't let anyone tell you light doesn't matter," she'd say. "Light tells the truth when people won't." She mailed me her old Leica camera for my 19th birthday, wrapped in brown paper with a handwritten note. "Let this lead you where your heart can't go yet." I carried it everywhere. Years passed, and while my classmates worried about internships and portfolios, I was chasing stories. The overlooked, the tired, the beautiful, and the broken. I'd visit Connecticut on holidays, but it always felt like walking back into a museum exhibit I didn't belong in. My father would ask about grades, never about the photos. My mother would fuss over my clothes, my hair, and remind me to be careful what you post online. The gap between us grew into something that couldn't be discussed. Then in 2018, everything changed. Grandma Julia's health declined quickly. I spent weekends taking the train to her house in Providence, bringing soup, and showing her new photos on my laptop. She'd smile weakly, pointing at the images. "You see, people," she whispered once, "that's a gift. Don't let anyone turn it into shame." The last time I saw her, she asked me to open the curtains. "More light," she murmured, squinting at the sky. "Promise me you'll follow it." "I promise," I said, even though my throat felt tight. A week later, she was gone. The funeral was small, quiet. My mother came wearing black gloves. My father didn't. "He has a trial," my mother explained, as if that excused everything. I stood beside the grave long after everyone else had left. The ground was cold and snow had started to fall again. My hands shook as I lifted the Leica, taking one picture of her headstone, the flowers and the fading light behind them. I whispered, "You were right, Grandma. Light tells the truth." In that moment, something inside me settled, a fragile but determined peace. I decided I would make her proud, even if it meant standing alone. Even if it meant proving to my father that the daughter he dismissed as a dreamer could turn her dreams into something undeniable. When I walked away from the grave, the snow was falling harder, but I didn't feel cold. I only felt the weight of the promise I'd just made. My father's face filled the TV screen, sharp and confident beneath the lights of the American Legal Summit in Washington, D.C. His voice carried the smooth authority of someone who'd spent decades convincing juries, clients, and himself that he was always right. "Integrity," he said, pausing for effect, "is the cornerstone of law. Without honor, justice becomes theater." The audience applauded. I watched from my small Brooklyn apartment, the sound low but inescapable. On the screen he smiled, that rehearsed half-smile, the same one he used in every newspaper photo, every courtroom interview. He looked like a man carved out of principle. But I knew better. Voiceover in my head. He preached justice while teaching me silence. I turned the TV off. The silence that followed was heavier than the applause. A few days later, an email from my mother arrived. "Your father would like you to come home for dinner Sunday. It's important." Important in her language meant public. When I arrived at the house, the smell of cedar and polished leather hit me first. The dining room was set formally. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, a centerpiece of white roses. My father stood at the head of the table, a glass of scotch in hand, already mid-conversation with Helen Pierce, his longtime partner at the firm. Helen was in her 50s, elegant but sharp-eyed, the only woman my father seemed to respect. "Clara," he said, acknowledging me with a nod. "You remember Helen?" Of course, I said, forcing a smile. Helen's smile was genuine. "I've seen some of your photographs in the papers," she said. "The lighting you use. It's striking. You have a good eye." Before I could thank her, my father cut in. "She's still figuring out what she wants," he said. "Photography's a hobby, not a career." Helen's expression tightened just slightly. "Sometimes hobbies turn into more than that," she said gently. My father chuckled. "Perhaps. But she's a Hamilton. She'll come around eventually." I laughed quietly out of habit. My mother, seated beside him, changed the subject to Ethan's promotion. Ethan, sitting across from me, gave a sheepish grin. "Dad just wants you to be stable, Clara. He means well." Stable. Voice over in my head. In my father's world, stable meant obedient. Dinner stretched into small talk about politics and clients, all the language of control and influence. I excused myself as soon as dessert hit the table. As I stood to leave, Helen caught my arm gently. "Don't let anyone talk you out of your own story," she said. Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than polite. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice not to shake. Weeks passed. The city was cold and gray, the kind of winter light that made even the concrete shimmer. I got a call from a nonprofit in the Bronx, Workers' Hope Foundation, asking if I'd photograph their campaign about labor rights. They were documenting victims of workplace injuries, people who'd been ignored or silenced. It was exactly the kind of work that mattered to me. I said yes without hesitation. The first day on site, I met Rosa, a seamstress who'd lost 2 fingers in a factory accident. She showed me her hands and said softly, "They told me it was my fault." Her voice broke when she added, "They never paid my hospital bills." When I asked for the company's name, she hesitated. "They said they have big lawyers. We can't fight them." I wrote it down anyway. The name hit me like a blow. Arden Manufacturing Group. 2 days later, while editing photos, I searched the company's name online and froze. There it was in bold print. Hamilton and Pierce Law Group represents Arden Manufacturing in ongoing litigation. My stomach turned cold. I reread the headline 3 times, hoping I'd misread it. But it was right there. My father's firm defending the company that had ruined these people's lives. For hours, I stared at the photos on my screen. Rosa's trembling hands, the worn bandages, the hopeless faces. I thought of my father's speech about integrity. I heard his voice again. Hamiltons make law, not art. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the nonprofit's director called a meeting to plan the public release of the photo series. I sat quietly listening to the team discuss strategy, my pulse hammering in my throat. They wanted the pictures to expose corporate neglect, to make people angry. And they would. But I knew what would happen if my name was attached to them. If I released those photos, I wouldn't just be exposing a company. I'd be exposing my father. After the meeting, I stood outside the small office on Jerome Avenue, watching steam rise from a street grate. My camera hung heavy around my neck. I thought about my mother, her soft voice asking me to not make him lose face. I thought about the dinners, the laughter, the empty praise. And then I thought about Rosa, about the way she had looked at her hands when she said, "They told me it was my fault." Maybe integrity wasn't inherited. Maybe it was chosen. That night I went back to the factory site one last time. The workers were finishing late. The air smelled of oil and dust. Rosa sat by the door, wrapping her hands in thin gloves. When she saw me, she smiled faintly. "Are you going to take more pictures?" she asked. I nodded. "One more." I lifted the Leica to my eye. The light overhead was harsh, slicing across her face, revealing every scar and shadow. "Look at me," I said quietly. She did. The flash went off white and searing. For an instant the world froze. The broken machinery behind her, the hollow hum of the factory, the truth I could no longer unsee. That click of the shutter was the beginning. The sound of a daughter turning against everything her father built. By early 2020, the photographs had taken on a life of their own. What began as a quiet project for a nonprofit became something louder, heavier, unstoppable. I titled the collection, "Light Exposes Lies." Each image showed the faces of workers forgotten by the system. Women with bandaged hands, men standing beside the ruins of machines that had nearly killed them. Their eyes carried the weight of truth, and I wanted people to see it. When a small New York art magazine picked up the story, I didn't expect much. They printed 5 of the photos across 4 pages with a bold headline that read, "Photographer exposes shadows of power." It wasn't glossy or sensational, but it spread fast. By the end of the week, the article had been shared thousands of times. Bloggers picked it up, and journalists began asking which corporations were responsible. That's when the trouble started. 2 days later, I woke to a string of missed calls from my mother. Her voice trembled on voicemail. "Your father is furious. Call him immediately." When I finally answered, his voice exploded through the line. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I told the truth," I said quietly. "You exposed my client," he barked. "We just lost a multi-million-dollar contract because of your little crusade." I pressed my phone tighter against my ear, trying to stay calm. "Maybe you lost it because they did something wrong." Silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "You are the biggest disappointment of my life, Clara. I built a name respected in every courtroom in this country, and you—" His voice cracked slightly, a sound I'd never heard before. "You've destroyed it with a camera." He hung up before I could respond. For a moment I just stood there, the phone still in my hand, the city humming faintly outside my window. I wasn't sure whether to cry or scream. Instead, I turned on the radio just to fill the air and sat staring at the photos pinned along my wall. Voiceover in my mind, I had never heard his voice shake, until power itself was touched by light. Within a week, rumors started circulating at my agency. I noticed meetings happening without me clients suddenly rescheduling colleagues, avoiding eye contact. Then one morning my manager asked to see me. She looked uncomfortable, eyes darting toward the glass door. "Clara, I'm sorry. We have to terminate your contract." "For what?" "There's pressure," she said softly, "from people connected to your father's firm. It's complicated. You've become a liability." I nodded, slowly, numb. "So telling the truth makes me unemployable now." She didn't answer. That evening, I went to my mother's apartment. She was pacing when I arrived, her hair disheveled, eyes red. "He didn't mean everything he said," she murmured. "He's just angry. But you're making things worse, Clara. You're burning every bridge you have." "I didn't set the fire, Mom," I said. "He did years ago." She sank onto the couch, trembling. "You're throwing away your future." "No," I said softly. "I'm saving it." Her tears came then, quiet but relentless. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't lie anymore, not even for peace. A few days later, I packed a single suitcase and left New York. I couldn't bear the sight of the skyline anymore, couldn't stand knowing my father's influence reached even into the spaces I thought were mine. I found a small room for rent in Beacon, upstate New York. It smelled faintly of dust and old paint, but there was a window that faced the Hudson River. The landlady, Mrs. Connors, was kind. "It's small, but the light's good in the morning," she said. She had no idea how much that mattered. Most of my belongings stayed in storage. All I kept were my cameras, a folding table, and a lamp that cast a steady pool of light across the wall. I began to work again quietly this time, photographing what I saw from that window. Fog drifting over water, reflections of trains passing at night, silhouettes of strangers, walking dogs in the snow. Light still told stories even when no one was watching. One night, unable to sleep, I walked across the room and turned on the lamp. Its glow fell against a framed print of one of my own photographs. Rosa, sitting in the factory doorway, the faintest hint of defiance in her expression. The glass caught the light, throwing a dim reflection of my own face beside hers. For a second I couldn't tell where she ended, and I began. I sat down staring at it, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the quiet rhythm of my breathing. If this was the price of telling the truth, I thought then it was mine to pay. I traced the edge of the photo with my fingers and whispered to the room, "If this is the cost, I accept it." The light flickered slightly, catching my reflection again. A reminder that even in the smallest space, even when the world went dark, the light still found me. It was a cold March evening in 2021 when I wandered into a small photo exhibition in Lower Manhattan. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd seen the flyer taped to a cafe window that afternoon and walked in mostly to escape the rain. The gallery was barely larger than a classroom, its white walls crowded with frames, its corners smelling faintly of paint and espresso. I moved slowly from one photograph to another, letting the hush of the space steady me. And then I stopped. There on the far wall hung one of my own pieces. The Factory Girl. I hadn't realized the curator had included it from an earlier submission. The image showed Rosa sitting under the buzzing glow of a neon bulb, the shadow of a broken machine stretching behind her like a scar. A voice behind me said, "You don't just take pictures, you record conscience." I turned. A man stood there. Mid-30s, tall with weathered hands and a camera slung across his shoulder like it had always belonged there. His name tag read, James Monroe, investigative journalist. I smiled, unsure. That's a generous interpretation. He shook his head. No, that photo doesn't accuse, but it doesn't excuse either. It makes people uncomfortable. That's honesty. We talked for an hour that night. About truth, about the cost of seeing too much about the moments people would rather look away from. He told me he'd spent years photographing refugee camps and industrial disasters for National Geographic. I told him I was still trying to rebuild a career that my own family had nearly erased. He didn't flinch. Sometimes, the hardest stories start at home, he said quietly. It was the first time someone understood without needing a translation. We began to meet for coffee after that. First out of professional curiosity, then out of genuine connection. Our conversations weren't about comfort. They were about purpose. James believed in the power of images the way some people believe in God. A photograph, he said once, doesn't change the world, but it reminds the world that change is overdue. One afternoon, as we sat at a noisy cafe near Houston Street, he looked up from his phone and said, "There's someone you should meet. Michael Reyes. He's the photo editor at CNN. He's seen your Light Exposes Lies series." I showed it to him. I froze mid-sip. "You what?" He grinned. "You're welcome." He wants to talk. CNN's planning a feature on women using visual storytelling to challenge power. A week later, I found myself in a glass-walled office at CNN headquarters, sitting across from Michael Reyes. A man in his 40s with kind eyes and a voice that sounded like late-night radio. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through my printed portfolio. "These are remarkable," he said finally. "Unflinching but compassionate. You don't humiliate your subjects. You honor them. We're launching a new segment, Women Who See the Truth. I'd like you to submit a full proposal." I nodded, trying to stay composed even as my heart pounded. I'd be honored. After the meeting, I called Tara, my best friend since college, the only person who'd stayed through every failure. She screamed so loudly through the phone that people in the street turned to look at me. "Clara Hamilton. Are you kidding me, CNN? You're sending me your headshot tonight. We're fixing your portfolio. No more hiding behind moody shadows." She spent the next week helping me rebuild everything, writing recommendation letters, editing my artist statement, forcing me to get new portraits. "You look like you're in witness protection in the old one," she said, snapping photos against the brick wall of my apartment. "Smile like the world hasn't completely broken you." I laughed, and for once it didn't feel forced. James checked in constantly. "Don't overthink it," he told me. "Just tell the truth. That's what you do best." I realized somewhere between the phone calls and coffee runs that I'd stopped waiting for someone to doubt me. He never tried to save me, never offered advice disguised as approval. He just listened. Voiceover in my head. For the first time, I saw a man who looked at me without judgment. Weeks passed in anxious silence. Every email notification made my chest tighten. I kept telling myself not to care, not to expect anything. But every night I'd stare at the submission folder on my laptop like it was a ticking clock. Then one Thursday morning, as I poured coffee into a chipped mug, my laptop chimed. The subject line glowed on the screen. "Congratulations, your work has been shortlisted for CNN's Women of the Year 2023. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world around me blurred. The hum of the fridge, the rain tapping against the window, the coffee overflowing onto the counter. Then Tara's voice came through on speakerphone. "You got it, didn't you?" I laughed, shaking, unable to speak. She screamed. "You did, I knew it, Clara. Do you realize what this means I did?" It meant every humiliation, every slammed door, every night spent in that small room with a single lamp had led here. I read the email again, slower this time, letting the words sink in. "Your work has been recognized for its contribution to truth and justice through visual storytelling." Truth and justice, two things my father had claimed to own. Karma doesn't rush, but it always arrives. I stood by the window watching the city lights shimmer against the wet pavement below. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind that comes from forgiveness, but from finally being seen for what I was meant to be. The first time my father called after the CNN article, I almost didn't answer. The headline had been everywhere that week. Photographer Clara Hamilton's work shines a light on hidden injustice. I had tried to stay away from the comments, but even without reading them, I could feel his anger brewing through the silence. When I finally picked up, his voice was low, tight with rage. "I gave you every opportunity, Clara. And this is how you repay me, by humiliating your own family on a national platform." I took a deep breath. "I didn't humiliate anyone, Dad. I told the truth." "You used our name," he snapped. "Hamilton. You made it sound like your father built his reputation on corruption and lies." I closed my eyes, steadying myself. "If the truth makes you look bad, that's not my fault." For a second, there was only the sound of his breathing, short and harsh. Then he said, almost shaking, "You're no daughter of mine," and the line went dead. I stood there for a long time, staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. It wasn't the first time he'd cut me off, but this felt different, final, like a sentence being passed. That evening, my mother called. Her voice trembled the way it always did when she was caught between us. "He's angry, Clara. He thinks you've made him a laughingstock." "I didn't name him," I said quietly. "That doesn't matter. Everyone knows who you are." "Please don't make this worse. Your father, he lives for his reputation. If you keep pushing him, he'll destroy everything. Himself, you the firm." I wanted to scream, "Then let him," but I didn't. I only said, "You love him more than the truth, don't you?" Her silence was answer enough. Voice over in my mind. My mother loved my father more than she loved what was right. Days passed and the story refused to die. CNN invited me for a follow-up interview. My photos appeared on advocacy websites, my name trending beside words like courage and truth teller. To the world, I was a symbol. To my father, I was a betrayal. Then one morning, I saw it. An announcement in the Greenwich Journal. Hamilton and Pierce Law Group to host annual Christmas Gala, a celebration of legacy. The event would take place at the country club, broadcast by several local media outlets. One of the sponsors listed was CNN. I knew immediately it wasn't coincidence. Later that week, I overheard a leaked call between Helen Pierce and one of her colleagues. Someone had sent me the recording. Her voice was calm, but sharp. "Richard's playing a dangerous game. That girl of his, she's not a child anymore. She's got light of her own." Then my father's voice cold and certain. "That light will go out when I step on stage." I deleted the message, but his words stayed with me. A few days later, an email arrived from my mother. "We'd love for you to come to the Christmas dinner. Just one evening. Please." It didn't mention the gala, the cameras, or the press. Just a dinner. When I showed the email to Tara, she frowned. "You can't go back there, Clara. Not after everything he said. If I don't go now," I said, "I'll spend the rest of my life running from him." "Then go," she said, her voice softening. "But go as who you are, not who he made you." That night I sat alone in front of the mirror in my small apartment, the city humming quietly beyond the window. The green dress hung on the door, the same one I'd worn the year before. The one he'd called too bold. I ran my fingers over the fabric, smoothing out invisible creases. The reflection looking back at me was older, steadier. My hair had grown longer, my eyes darker from sleepless nights. I looked like someone who had survived her own family's war and was finally ready to stop hiding. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the small button camera James had given me months earlier. A press badge prototype he'd been testing. I clipped it discreetly inside the fold of my clutch. Every story deserves a witness, he'd told me once. I looked at myself one last time in the mirror. The faint hum of the city mixed with my heartbeat. My hands didn't shake anymore. Sometimes you have to walk back into the place that broke you just to prove it can't anymore. I slipped on the emerald dress and fastened the clasp at my neck. The color caught the lamplight reflecting faintly against the wall like water. I took a slow breath and whispered, "If they want to see who I am, I'll show them." Then I picked up my coat, turned off the light, and stepped into the night. There are parties meant to celebrate, and others meant to test who you've become. The Hamilton estate gleamed like something out of a winter postcard. Snow dusted the roof, crystal lights framed the windows, and a live cello quartet filled the air with soft, deliberate notes. Inside, waiters in white gloves moved like clockwork between marble pillars. The scent of pine and expensive perfume mingled under chandeliers so bright they could have passed for daylight. I arrived early, the crunch of snow following my steps. When I handed my coat to the attendant, a young waiter glanced at the camera clipped discreetly inside my bag. "Press?" he asked politely. I smiled. "No, just family." His eyes widened a little, and I watched him retreat without another word. The grand hall was already glowing. White roses, candles, champagne towers lined up like glass cathedrals. I could see my mother across the room issuing quiet instructions to the catering staff. When she turned and saw me, her smile flickered. Half relief, half fear. "I'm glad you came," she whispered when I reached her, glancing nervously toward the staircase. "Your father doesn't know yet. He's busy greeting guests." "I'm not here for him," I said softly. She looked down, smoothing an invisible crease on her dress. "Please, Clara, just don't make tonight harder than it already is." As guests began arriving, the room filled with that particular energy of old money. Conversations about investment funds, Ivy League admissions, and vacation homes on the Cape. Laughter rose and fell like an orchestra rehearsed to perfection. I stood near the edge of it all, a silent observer to a life that used to be mine. Ethan appeared beside our father, leading a group of partners from the firm. Richard Hamilton looked unshakable. His silver cufflinks glinted. His laughter rolled across the room like applause. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, the proud patriarch, the untouchable man of justice. Watching him, I realized I no longer recognized the man who had once taught me how to ride a bike. Helen Pierce arrived not long after, poised as ever, her expression calm but alert. When she saw me, she crossed the room with quiet determination. "Clara," she said, taking my hand lightly. "You look radiant." "Thank you," I said. "I wasn't sure I should come." Her eyes softened. "Don't let them dim your light," she murmured. "Some people mistake control for strength. You know the difference." Before I could respond, Richard's voice rose above the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, tapping his glass with the precision of someone born to command attention, "if I could have your eyes for a moment." The room hushed. Waiters froze mid-pour. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate not only the holidays, but also another remarkable year for Hamilton and Pierce." He turned toward Ethan, smiling. "My son has proven himself a man of integrity and talent, bringing honor to our name and our work." Applause filled the room. Ethan nodded modestly, his expression tight. And my father continued, pausing just long enough to make everyone curious. "My daughter Clara," he gestured vaguely toward me, "believes photography can change the world." A ripple of polite laughter spread through the guests. "She will not receive a cent from me," he said smoothly, raising his glass. "But perhaps she'll capture this moment as one of her artistic experiments." Laughter again, louder this time. My mother's face went pale. Ethan's eyes darted toward me, pleading silently for restraint. The sound of my heartbeat drowned out the room for a second. Then I lifted my champagne glass. "I never asked for your money," I said evenly, my voice calm but clear enough to carry. "I only photographed the light you refused to see." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. My father froze mid-smile, his face stiffening. The guests looked from him to me, unsure whether to laugh or leave. Helen raised her own glass. "To light," she said softly. A few others hesitated, then followed her lead. To light, they echoed their voices, uneasy but sincere. My father set his glass down slowly. Always dramatic, he said the words forced through a strained smile. "Just like her grandmother." I met his gaze for a long moment, then turned away. Voiceover in my mind. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is your calmness. The string quartet began playing again, too quickly, too loudly. The crowd tried to recover, pretending nothing had happened. But I could feel it. The shift, the crack running through the perfect surface of my father's empire. I walked out through the side doors, the cold air rushing against my skin like freedom. Outside, the snow was falling thicker, blanketing the driveway, muting the sounds of the world behind me. From where I stood, I could still see the golden lights flickering through the windows, the laughter continuing as if the truth hadn't just walked out into the night. I exhaled, a plume of white mist rising in front of me. My shoulders loosened, the tension finally breaking. I think I whispered to myself, I just closed the last door to my past. The cello played on faintly behind the walls, a muffled echo of something that no longer belonged to me. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating the next morning. At first I thought it was just Tara checking if I'd made it home in one piece after the Hamilton circus. But when I finally reached for it, the screen was exploding with notifications. Texts, emails, missed calls. Tara's message sat at the top, glowing like a warning flare. "You're viral. Someone filmed the entire thing." I sat up in bed, my pulse hammering as I clicked the link she sent. The video had already been uploaded to half a dozen platforms. Prominent lawyer publicly insults daughter at holiday gala. The clip showed me standing across the ballroom from my father, his voice sharp and cutting the room, laughing on cue. Then my reply. Clear, calm, defiant. "I never asked for your money. I only photographed the light you refused to see." Someone had overlaid slow piano music and added captions. It had already been viewed over 2 million times. The comments section was chaos. Half the people praised me, calling me brave, calling it poetic justice. The others defended him, calling me ungrateful, spoiled, dramatic. Voiceover in my head. Some lights you don't choose. They find you when you've already lost everything else. By noon, journalists were calling. I ignored them all. I couldn't bear the idea of turning this into another headline. Then Tara burst through my apartment door, breathless, waving her phone. "You need to turn on the TV right now." "What now?" I muttered, reaching for the remote. The CNN logo flashed across the screen. The anchor's voice was calm, deliberate. "And now the announcement of our 2024 Women of the Year honorees. Women who have illuminated truth in the face of power." Photographer Clara Hamilton, recognized for shedding light on corporate exploitation through her groundbreaking series, Light Exposes Lies. My photo appeared on the screen. Me standing behind my camera, sunlight cutting across my face. For a moment I couldn't move. Tara gasped. "Oh my God! Clara, that's you!" I didn't answer. My throat closed. I could only stare at the screen as if it belonged to someone else. "You did it," she whispered, then shouted, "You actually did it." Her arms wrapped around me, shaking me back into the room. I laughed, breathless, on the edge of tears. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, everything was unraveling. At the headquarters of Hamilton and Pierce, my father was mid-meeting when the same broadcast appeared on the wall-mounted screen. The CNN anchor's voice filled the room, alternating between footage of my viral confrontation and the segment praising my work. for her courage in exposing systemic corporate negligence photographer Clara Hamilton, daughter of prominent attorney Richard Hamilton, reminds us that integrity sometimes begins where legacy ends. The words hung there like a verdict. No one spoke. My father's jaw tightened as the screen split between his face from the gala, smiling cruelly, and the image of me on the CNN stage radiant free. Helen Pierce was the first to break the silence. "You should probably turn that off," she said softly. He didn't move. The anchor continued. "Due to ethical conflicts, CNN has officially terminated all legal representation previously held by Hamilton and Pierce." Gasps rippled around the conference table. One of the younger partners dropped his pen. My father finally spoke voice hoarse. "That's not possible." Helen folded her hands, calm but firm. "It's already done. The board confirmed it this morning. You can't fight a story that's already true, Richard." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, eyes wide and hollow. "You think she won?" Helen sighed. "I think the light finally caught up to you. At home in Connecticut, my mother watched the same broadcast. When my photo appeared again, she pressed a hand over her mouth. For years, she'd watched me shrink in his shadow. Now on screen, I was standing in the sun, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered to no one. She did it." My brother Ethan texted soon after. "I saw the news. I'm sorry for not standing up for you. You won the only way he'll ever understand, by being seen." I typed back. "It was never about winning," then deleted it before sending. Instead, I wrote simply, "Thank you." The next day, the noise only grew louder. Emails poured in from organizations, galleries, magazines. People wanted interviews, photographs, panels. It was surreal. This sudden validation for something I'd been told would never matter. But beneath the excitement was a strange calm. That night, I walked through Times Square, the cold wind pushing against my coat, neon lights flickering over my face. My own photograph flashed across a digital billboard, a promotion for the upcoming CNN gala. For a moment, I stood there just watching. The light shifted across my reflection in a shop window, bright and fleeting. Karma doesn't rush, but it never forgets. I took a slow breath and smiled, not out of pride but peace. I hadn't set out to destroy my father. I hadn't even tried to change him. I'd only told the truth, and the world had finally listened. "I didn't get revenge," I whispered to myself, watching the lights shimmer against the wet pavement. "I just lived honestly, and the world saw it." The snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, blurring the billboards into a wash of white and color. For the first time, the light didn't hurt my eyes. It felt like home. A week after the gala, the news broke Hamilton and Pierce had lost 3 major clients. It was everywhere. Morning talk shows, business columns, legal blogs. The same firms that had once bragged about their association with my father were now quietly severing ties, citing ethical concerns. For the first time, the Hamilton name wasn't a symbol of prestige. It was a warning. I saw the headlines while waiting for my train to Midtown, where the CNN production office was located. The invitation had arrived 2 days earlier. "We would be honored to have you speak at the Women of the Year Gala." The producer, Maya Green, had followed up personally with a phone call. Her voice had been steady warm. "Clara, we'd like you to talk about courage and truth, not just as an artist, but as someone who's lived it. Your story resonates because it isn't about revenge. It's about resilience." Now, as I stood in line for coffee, I rehearsed my notes in my head. Every draft I'd written had started to sound like an apology, so I'd thrown them away. This wasn't about my father or the chaos that followed. It was about light, the kind that burns quietly, persistently, even when no one notices. The night of the gala. New York felt alive with anticipation. The ballroom at the CNN Center glittered with gold light cameras flashing across rows of tables, filled with journalists, activists, and artists. I wore a simple navy gown and no jewelry, only my grandmother's old Leica camera, small and silent in my bag. A reminder of why I'd started. Backstage, Maya found me adjusting the mic on my dress. "Nervous?" she asked. A little, I admitted. I'm not used to people listening, she smiled. They're not just listening, Clara. They're waiting. When the stage lights dimmed, a montage of the year's honorees played across massive screens. Scientists, doctors, teachers. And then my photo appeared. The caption read, Clara Hamilton, illuminating justice through truth. The applause that followed was thunderous. I stepped into the light, the stage warm beneath my heels. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Then I found the teleprompter. But I didn't need it. I used to think I began my voice steady that to be heard you had to shout. That the world only listened when you broke yourself open loud enough to make them uncomfortable. The room was silent. But I've learned something different. Sometimes silence is the loudest voice. Sometimes standing still. Refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize. Is how you tell the truth. I paused, scanning the crowd. Maya smiled from the front row. I don't speak tonight to expose anyone. I continued. I speak to thank the people who believed that art could be armor, that truth could be a form of love, and that light doesn't destroy. It reveals. Applause rose again, wave after wave, until I could barely hear myself breathe. I smiled, blinking back tears. Thank you for seeing what I saw. As I stepped off stage, my chest felt light, my pulse calm for the first time in months. Meanwhile, somewhere across town in an office that had once felt untouchable, my father sat alone. The television in his corner played the same broadcast, the blue light washing over the room like a confession. The camera cut from my face on stage to the footage of the Christmas gala. His laughter, his words, the crowd's reaction. It played like a cruel symmetry. He didn't move. Papers lay scattered across his desk, untouched. The glass of scotch beside him was still full. For years he had controlled every story that bore his name. Now one story, mine, had rewritten everything. Helen Pierce stood in the doorway silent for a long moment before saying softly, "You should go home, Richard." He didn't look up. "It used to be my home," he said, his voice thin. Helen hesitated. Legacy doesn't disappear when the truth comes out. It just changes shape. Maybe it's her turn to carry it. He didn't answer. Back at the gala, I watched from the wings as the program continued. People shook my hand, congratulated me, asked for photos. I smiled, said thank you, and tried to memorize it. Not for vanity, but as proof that survival could look like this. By the time the event ended, the city was glowing under light rain. I walked alone down 58th Street toward the CNN building, my heels clicking against wet pavement. The giant digital screen outside the building flashed the night's highlights. My face appeared again. Eyes, steady voice captured mid-sentence. For a long time I just stood there watching my reflection layered over the image of myself. When you finally step out of the dark, even the ones who tried to bury you can't help but see the light. The rain turned to mist, blurring the city's edges, softening everything. I zipped my coat, still holding the program from the gala. It was creased now, damp at the corners, but it felt warm in my hands. Somewhere in that moment, under the glow of a city that once ignored me, I understood what freedom really meant. It wasn't being celebrated or forgiven. It was walking into the light without flinching. In his office, my father sat alone, the sound of rain tapping against the tall glass windows. The television flickered on the wall across from him, replaying the CNN gala for what must have been the 10th time. My voice filled the room, calm and steady, as the screen showed me standing beneath golden lights, speaking about courage and truth. He reached for the remote and muted it, leaving only the silent glow of the picture. The camera cut to my face as the audience applauded. For a moment, his reflection merged with mine in the glass. Two Hamiltons separated by a truth he could no longer control. He turned away, his eyes landing on an old photograph on the bookshelf, a family portrait taken years ago. He was younger then, his hair darker, his arm wrapped stiffly around my mother's waist. Ethan and I stood in front, our smiles practiced. He picked up the frame and studied it as if the people inside might speak. Voiceover in my mind. I don't know what he thought in that moment, but I know the feeling of losing something you can't buy back. Respect. He sat at his desk, pulled out a piece of stationery with the firm's embossed logo, and began to write. The pen hesitated the ink, blotting slightly where his hand trembled. Clara, he wrote, I don't know how to be the kind of father you needed, but I'm proud of you. I see now that you were never against me. You were for something bigger. Maybe one day you'll understand that I was afraid of what I didn't know how to love. He read it twice, then folded the page carefully and slipped it into an envelope. He didn't seal it, didn't write an address. He just placed it on the desk beside the family photo. A knock came at the door. Helen Pierce stepped in, her tone gentle but firm. You've been avoiding calls all day. I'm not in the mood to explain myself, he said quietly. She looked around the office, half-empty boxes of files piled near the wall. You've spent your whole life teaching others about justice. Maybe it's time you learn what it feels like to live it. He gave a bitter half-smile. Justice doesn't pay the bills, Helen. No, she said softly. But it might help you sleep. She left him there with the muted television still casting its pale light across the room. Later that week, my mother came to New York unannounced. I found her waiting in the corner of a small cafe near Central Park, her gloves still on a cup of tea cooling in front of her. When she saw me, her face broke into a tentative smile. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I almost didn't. I admitted, sliding into the seat across from her. For a while, neither of us spoke. The hum of conversation filled the space between us. Then she sighed. I've been thinking a lot about that night, about all the nights before it. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of him, of losing everything we built. But I understand now, fear costs more than truth ever will. Her voice trembled at the end. I reached across the table and took her hand. You can start over, Mom. You still have time. She looked down at our joined hands, her rings catching the light. Maybe I already have, she said quietly. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow. We sat there for a long time, saying little, just letting silence do what words never could. Sometimes people have to lose everything before they find their courage. The next morning, I woke to a flood of news alerts. Ethan had made headlines. Ethan Hamilton leaves father's firm, launches legal aid for labor victims. The article featured his photo, sleeves rolled up, standing in front of a modest new office downtown. A quote from his interview followed. I learned more from my sister in 1 year than in 10 years in court. Justice doesn't come from winning cases. It comes from listening to the people no one defends. I read the words twice, my chest tightening. That afternoon, Ethan called. You saw the article I did. I said, smiling, you always were the brave one, you know. He laughed softly. That's funny. I was about to say the same thing about you. For the first time in years, we didn't talk about our father. We didn't have to. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It felt like peace. When the call ended, I stood by my apartment window watching the city blur beneath the falling snow. Somewhere out there, my father was sitting in his quiet office, maybe staring at that unsent letter. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger toward him. Only distance, like two stars, once part of the same constellation, now burning alone in different corners of the sky. By March 2024, the walls of a small gallery in Soho glowed with white light. My exhibition, Light Exposes Lies, had finally found its permanent home. Photographs printed larger than I'd ever dared, each one suspended in silence, speaking for itself. People moved slowly through the space, artists, students, reporters, couples holding hands. Some whispered, some stood still for minutes in front of a single image. It felt different this time. The crowd wasn't looking for scandal or headlines. They were looking for truth. I stood near the center of the room beside my mother, who had helped organize the event. She wore a simple black dress, her hair swept back, her face calm. A nameplate near the entrance read, "In partnership with the Women Who See the Truth Foundation, founded by Clara Hamilton." She had used her savings to start it months earlier, funding small scholarships for women in journalism and photography. She said it was something worth standing for. "Busy night," she said softly, glancing around the packed room. "It doesn't feel like mine," I said. "It feels like theirs." She smiled. "Maybe that's how you know you've done it right." The hum of conversation faded for a moment as someone new entered the gallery. Nah, I saw him before my mother did. A tall figure in a dark coat, his hair grayer than I remembered. He moved quietly, his steps, almost hesitant eyes scanning the walls until they stopped at one photograph near the corner, the girl in shadow. The image showed a young woman sitting by a cracked window, sunlight slanting across her face, half in light, half in dark. It was one of the first pictures I'd ever taken, before Light Exposes Lies became a movement, back when I was still trying to understand what truth looked like. My mother followed my gaze and went still. "He's here," she whispered. I nodded once. Sometimes showing up is enough. We didn't move toward him. He didn't move toward us. But something shifted in the room, a current of quiet recognition. People gave him space, as if instinctively understanding that whatever was happening didn't need witnesses. He stood there for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the photo. Then he turned toward the small donation table near the exit. Without a word, he pulled out his checkbook and wrote something carefully, the pen trembling just enough to betray the effort. He signed the check and slipped it into the glass donation box marked Women Who See the Truth Foundation. He didn't look at the volunteers, didn't wait for acknowledgement. He simply turned back toward the photograph. When our eyes finally met across the gallery, there were no words. Only a shared understanding, something too fragile to name. His face looked older than I remembered, but softer, like the weight he'd carried was finally setting him down. My mother exhaled quietly beside me, her voice barely audible. "He's trying." "I know," I said. Voiceover in my mind, justice doesn't only live in courtrooms. It lives in the moments when someone finally dares to look directly at the truth. As I stood there, sunlight began to filter through the high windows of the gallery, spilling across the floor in gold streaks. It caught the glass of the donation box, reflecting onto the wall where the photograph hung. The beam of light spread until it reached the three of us, my mother, my father, and Meitai, standing at different corners of the same space, connected by its glow. Ethan arrived halfway through the evening, still in his work suit, sleeves rolled up. He looked exhausted but happy. When he saw our father, he hesitated, then crossed the room slowly. My father turned, startled, as Ethan stopped in front of him. No words passed between them. Ethan simply placed a hand on his shoulder. Gentle, brief, but full of something deeper than forgiveness. It was acknowledgement, the quiet kind that means "I see you. Let's move forward." My father nodded once, eyes glistening, before turning back to the photograph. For a while, the four of us just stood there. Evelyn beside me, Ethan beside him. The air filled with the faint hum of conversation and the clicking of distant cameras. The light from the window grew stronger, reflecting off the framed images, bouncing softly from one to another, until the whole room seemed to shimmer. It touched everyone there. Guests, artists, strangers. It felt like the world was breathing again. When the evening ended, my father left without saying a word. But on his way out, he stopped by the guest book at the entrance and wrote something. Later, when I flipped through it, I found his handwriting. "Truth is not an accusation. It's an arrival." I traced the words with my fingers and let them sink in. Outside, the sky had darkened, the streets glowing under early spring rain. The gallery lights reflected in every puddle, each one carrying a small piece of the same gold light that had filled the room. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing alone in the light. We all were. Christmas 2024 arrived quietly without glitter or noise. I drove up to Connecticut for the first time in months, the road winding through pale morning light and snow that looked untouched. When I reached the old Hamilton house, it was exactly as I remembered, tall, proud, and too big for the people left inside. But something about it felt softer now. Through the window, I could see the Christmas tree glowing faintly in the living room. No grand banquet this time, no guests in gowns and tuxedos. Just warmth. Just peace. Voiceover in my mind, I used to think I needed my father's approval to have worth. But value doesn't come from being seen. It comes from daring to believe in yourself. I parked by the edge of the driveway and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled of pine and snow, the kind of clean silence that fills every space where words used to hurt. I walked slowly around the yard, camera in hand. The snow had begun to melt in small patches, and the morning sun caught the ice crystals like glass. I raised my camera and took a few pictures. The garden bench where I used to sit as a child, the steps that led to the front porch, the branches heavy with frost. It wasn't about documenting the house anymore. It was about making peace with it. Inside, my mother moved through the living room, straightening the ornaments on the tree. She looked up when I entered, her face breaking into a quiet smile. "You came," she said simply. "I didn't want you to spend Christmas alone." She laughed softly. "I'm not alone anymore." She gestured toward the fireplace where a new photo hung in a wooden frame. It was one I had taken years ago. My grandmother Julia sitting by her window, sunlight touching her cheek. The photo had won no awards, but it was my favorite. "I found it while cleaning the attic," my mother said. "She looks proud, doesn't she?" I nodded. She always was. We stood together in silence, the fire crackling. Then she turned to me, her expression tender but heavy. "Ethan called this morning. He's on his way." As if on cue, the door opened and Ethan stepped in, brushing snow from his coat. He looked older, more grounded, but there was light in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "Still taking pictures in the snow," he teased. "Old habits," I said, smiling. He hugged our mother, then turned to me. "I've been meaning to tell you something. Dad's in a nursing facility up in Maine. It's quiet near the coast. He asked for you." I froze, unsure how to respond. "What does he want?" Ethan hesitated. "Not to apologize exactly. He said he wants to thank you for everything you made him see." I looked down at my hands, then at the fire. Gratitude wasn't the word I expected to hear. "Does he know I might not come?" Ethan nodded. He said he'll wait either way. I took a deep breath. "Then when I'm ready, I'll go." He nodded again, no pressure, no judgment. That was the difference now. None of us were trying to control each other anymore. We spent the rest of the day quietly. My mother baked ginger cookies that filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon. Ethan told stories about his new firm, about the clients who couldn't believe a Hamilton had switched sides to defend workers. I laughed more than I thought I would. That night, as the fire burned low, I slipped outside again. The snow had stopped and the air was crisp and still. I lifted my camera once more, snapping a final picture. The old house under the faint orange glow of the porch light, the window reflecting the Christmas tree inside. Justice isn't victory. It's freedom in your heart. Revenge isn't about punishment. It's about living without fear. The world had changed around me, but the quiet inside me was new. I walked to the end of the driveway where the snow had begun to melt into soft, glistening puddles. The first light of dawn broke across the horizon, washing the world in gold. The reflection of that light shimmered on the lens of my camera as I lifted it toward the sky. Success, I thought, isn't loud. It's the gentle answer to all the times you were underestimated. I pressed the shutter. The click echoed softly in the morning air, a small sound that felt like closure. And as the sun climbed higher, I whispered one last truth to myself. I didn't win. I just became free. If you've ever been told you're not enough, let your success answer for you. Keep believing, keep fighting, and keep walking toward the light. Follow this channel for more real stories of courage, justice, and the quiet kind of freedom that changes everything.